Hi, and welcome back to video 2 on our tax series. Before we get started, I just want to relay a little story I thought was quite interesting. After the loss of her spouse, Mary is basically doing quite well. She gets a new hairstyle, a new dress, she's out socializing with friends. Overall, she looks good. Bob, on the other hand, is not doing as well after his wife passed. He's basically kind of disheveled. He really hasn't shaved. He hasn't changed his clothes. And overall, he really looks like heck. So here's the ultimate question. Why do most men live about 30 days after their spouse dies? And when I do the live programs, many people come, they're shouting out answers, and some are funny, some are not so funny. But it's really quite simple. That's when most of the food runs out of the house. Let's get started. We're going to talk about today taxes on our interest and dividends as we're going through this particular series. It's important not to pay tax on money that you're not spending. It sounds simple, but most people don't do it, and we really have a hard time understanding why. But again, it's pretty simple. Do not pay taxes on money that you're not spending. Here's an example. Everyone's heard of the term compound interest, and it's pretty straightforward. Let's say you put $50,000 in a CD or any kind of an investment, and it's going to earn 4%. And I know when I do a lot of the programs, and I'll throw a number out, and people start yelling, what bank is that? And they're emailing me. They want to know who's paying 4%. The reason I use 4% was simple. It's rounding numbers. So if you're earning 4% on $50,000, the interest is $2,000 for that particular year. Now, what a lot of folks do is they just rolling over their interest. So what will happen is they'll take the $2,000. They're not spending it, but they're just rolling it over. So there is tax that's due. You get a 1099 at the end of the year. And I had one gentleman came up to a meeting and he said, Joe, I don't pay any tax on my 1099s. I don't want any bank interest. I don't pay tax on it. I go, how do you do that? He says, I don't give the 1099s to the CPA. And I said, gee, that'll work. And he said, if they ever get caught, he said, I'm an old guy. I'll just pretend I forgot and didn't know what I was doing. But in this case, you get a 1099. You have to report that income. You got a $560 tax due on that $2,000 worth of interest. So what happens is now you take the $2,000 interest. You don't take it and spend it. You're taking it and you're rolling it over to the investment or leaving it in the investment. And now the next year, that amount that's earning interest is $52,000. Hence the concept of compound interest. Same thing happens that year. You're going to earn on the $52,000. You're going to earn 4%. It's going to be a little over $2,000 again. That gets rolled over. So if you look at year 3 or number 3 on there, it'll show you $54,057. But you got to realize that tax due is $576. The tax is going to keep going up. So let's speed it up and let's get out to year 10. In year 15, you're getting the interest on that money of $29.75. But let's take a look at what the tax is. The tax is $833. So what's important here? And a lot of times people find it difficult. Everyone has heard of the term compound interest. No one has ever heard of the term compound taxes. So remember, as our interest compounds, so do our taxes. And, my mom asked me a couple years ago, she said, Joe, I don't understand. I'm not doing anything different, but every year I keep paying more taxes. And she said, I didn't answer her. I was kind of ignoring her. She asked me again and again. Finally, I said, Ma, the reason you're paying more taxes is you're not doing anything. She goes, I don't understand. I'm not doing. I said, you're not spending any money. You're just rolling it over. So this is one of the things when we talk about don't pay taxes on money you're not spending. In this case, she wasn't spending it, but she was paying a lot of taxes. Now, a part of this...
Welcome to Download. We want you to be able to click with...
I'm going to call it phenomenon of compound interest, compound taxes. It's pretty simple. if you can look back, if you want to look back at the chart we had just prior, the first 2 years worth of taxes that you paid, the first year was $560, and the second year it was $576, and that went up to that $833 number in year 15. But here's a point that you have to realize. If you're paying the IRS the tax dollars, you can no longer use that money or even spend it. It's gone, it's over, it's finished. If you had the ability to take that money and use it or save it, and you took the $560 and you put it at interest for 4 years, at 4% for 5 years, that money would grow to $681. If you run it out for 15 years, that growth would be $1,008. So simply this, is you gave the government the taxes of $560, it really wasn't $560. The true amount, if you talk about a 15-year period, would have been a little over $1,000. So as we look at it, the same thing with the next year, it's $576. After 5 years, it grows to $735. And that will grow after 15 years to $1,197. So in 2 years, if you kept that interest in your pocket, you didn't give it to the IRS, you could have earned $1,008 on one, $560, and the $576, you're going to earn $1,197. Now, what's important here is that's a huge amount of dollars that now could be used to help fund your retirement, or help fund your expenses for Medicare that you have during retirement. So it's important to understand. It's a very, very simple concept. Compound taxes equals years of lost earnings. So you always want to try to remember, if I'm not spending the money, if I'm not using it currently, I don't want to pay tax on money I'm not using. What I explain is pretty straightforward. And I call it a mystery tax. We really don't, we don't think about it, but it's quite simple. It's this. Once you give away the dollars, it's called lost opportunity cost. If you ever done any reading on it, it's simply that once you give away the tax dollars, they can never be used again for your benefit. It's gone. It's totally finished. Now, a lot of folks will, I ask the question and I'll say, is it better to pay taxes now, or is it better to pay taxes later? And I'll get, varying answers, and pay now and pay later, it's whatever it is, and you'll get totally different answers. The concept here is this. Let's look at it with some real numbers. Should you pay taxes as you go? So let's assume there's a tax due and it's $2,700 on a particular investment or a savings. The next year, it's another $2,700. Over a 10-year period, simple, times 10, you would have paid $27,000. And I asked the question, it's pretty simple, how much of that money is yours? And people look at me, they go, they're just totally clueless. Obviously, if you're paid it in tax dollars, none of it's yours, it's all the IRS's. And they have the full $27,000. So that's what happens as what they call pay as you go. On the other hand, if you defer for 10 years, let's say you don't pay it and you defer it, you take the $2,700, and we talked about in the last example, and you have the ability to earn interest or invest it or do whatever you like with it. And let's say you can earn 5%. That money is going to grow. The $2,700 is going to grow at 5%. And the same scenario, at the end of 10 years, that account is worth $35,658. Important question. Is it all yours? And people, they give me some different answers. Most of them will say, no, it's not. There's some tax due on that, which they know. But let's say you give the government a third of it, which is a fairly high tax bracket. Well, let's take a third. Figure maybe some other income in there. You also have maybe some state tax. So the government's going to take a third, and here's the difference what you're going to be left with. You're going to net $2,390 or $23,890. That's a huge difference. And the concept here is if you have that $2,389, what could you do with it? Well, that's going to be for helping pay Medicare costs in retirement, helping fund old age, using that money just to take care of different costs due to inflation. So it's important to understand that when we talk taxes, it's very, very important that we look to try and find any way we can to save a few dollars, because ultimately those dollars will be needed somewhere down the road. Which do you want? You want to go and pay as you go and end up with nothing to show for it? Or ultimately you want to have the $24,000 in your pocket? Now, I can almost guarantee most folks are paying taxes on money they're not using and never realize that. If you look at your tax return, you'll see interest or dividends in there. And if you're not spending that, that's where you're going to see a lot of times that you're spending money that you're paying taxes on money that you're not spending. If you don't spend the money for tax dollars, where does it stay? That's obvious. If you're not giving it to the government, it's staying in your pocket for future use. Okay, let's get back to our tax list. We just finished talking about Social Security, interest on tax and dividends, capital gains. What we're going to talk about is pretty simple. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about capital gains taxes. What capital gains taxes are, it's simple. If you have an asset, whatever you purchased, even real estate, it could be any kind of investment, and you've had it for more than a year, the tax that's due on it is considered capital gains. You've had it for more than a year. That's the key factor. So what happens with capital gains, and I explain it as almost like a little monster, there's no offset in these gains due to inflation. In other words, the capital gain that you base the tax upon, how the tax is calculated, is not adjusted for any inflation. Let's look at this example. Let's say you purchased $100,000 of stock about 25 years ago, and the value has grown, hopefully, to about $200,000 today. If you sold the stock, it's pretty straightforward. You're going to get about $100,000 would be your gain. At a 20% tax bracket or a 20% tax rate on capital gains, your tax should be about $20,000. It's pretty straightforward, but most people have no problem understanding that concept when it comes to capital gains. But here's something I try to explain. I think is very critical. The $20,000 gain that you paid in tax is actually about 275% higher than what the real tax should be if you adjusted that gain for inflation. It's pretty straightforward. We all understand that $100,000 25 years ago was worth you can buy a lot more with it than $100,000 you can 25 years later. So because there's no adjustment for inflation in there, if you take a simple 4% inflation, it really eroded that $100,000 profit by about $62,490. That really leaves only about $37,000 as a true gain, not $100,000. So if you pay tax now at 20% of that gain, the tax would be about $7,500, which is a far cry from the $20,000. So overall, we try to explain with the taxes that you have to look at things from a different set of eyes. And a lot of times I try to tell people that the pro forma tax returns really help a lot, helping it all to become a little bit more clearer. When we look at we talk about a mystery tax, these are the little things that people don't see in there, is there's really no gain. You're just trying to keep pace with inflation. And if you use that prior example and say if you bought something 25, 30, 40 years ago, whatever, you paid $100,000 for it, it's now worth $200,000, but in the course of those 25, 30 years, inflation eroded that $100,000 profit to nothing. So $200,000 will buy you exactly what $100,000 would have bought you 25 or 30 years earlier. So technically, there should be no capital gains. You don't have a gain. There's nothing in there that you've got to be in a better position, but ultimately you are paying the tax on that full, I call it like almost a mystery gain. Let's look at this example with capital gains taxes. Since 2013, investors really fall into 4 different brackets. And that includes that 3.8% Medicare tax on investment income. Sometimes what a lot of folks don't realize, the sheer size of some capital gains will actually propel investors into higher tax brackets, and they ultimately finish with a lot less wealth. Let's look at this example. We have Joe and Kathy. They had about $90,000 of income from pension, Social Security, and some interest after all their deductions. Their investments are also generating an average of about $50,000 a year of long-term capital gains. If this couple recognizes the gain every year and pays the tax on it, their long-term capital gain tax rate will be 15%, or $7,500. Now, if you take that over a 10-year period, you're going to pay about $75,000 cumulative gains on $500,000 of capital gains. Very simple. So it's a deal. You got $500,000 in gains. You'll pay $7,500 a year. You did it over a 10-year period. You paid about $75,000. What's different? Kathy and Joe spoke to an advisor who advised them to do a tax mitigation. Let's do a tax saving program. And by using a tax managed strategy, they're basically deferring the gains on that $500,000, or deferring the tax on that $500,000 of gains. So if for some reason they need to make an investment change 10 years out, that gain will be taxed at a level of 15%, 18.8%, and 23.8% rates. The end result is they will pay out significantly more in taxes than being tax efficient for that decade. And I refer to it as an oxymoron. How could being tax efficient cause you to pay more taxes? And a lot of times I always tell folks, anytime you do a tax strategy or some idea, I'm investing in this, you need to do a pro forma tax return to see what the end results will be, so now you can compare it more logically. Now, if anybody remembers that I think it was 1965, Danger, Will Robinson Danger, that was a Lost in Space program, and I can't believe it's been 50 years. Did I just give you conflicting information? Well, the answer is no, but if you were truly listening, it sounds like conflicting information. What I did is simple. We talked about the example of paying now or paying later. And that first example, should you defer, should you pay that $7,500 a year for 10 years, or the $2,500 a year for 10 years, or should you defer and end up with about $24,000 in your pocket? The difference, when we talked about the capital gains, and that slide we just reviewed, that being tax efficient and deferring the tax actually made it a lot worse. The case here that I'm trying to bring out, and sometimes people don't listen well, or they'll just listen to a piece. Hey, Joe said always defer, or deferring taxes is better. That's not the case if you're comparing 2 different types of taxes. There's a huge difference between income taxes and capital gains. So if you're going to use things as a rule of thumb, you have to be very careful. That's why I always stress, and I sound like I'm a broken record sometimes, about doing a pro forma tax return to see what these things look like. you can't take a little information. Oh, I'm income taxes. I'm going to defer. I always work out better by deferring, and apply that metric to capital gains taxes. They're very, very different. So it's important to understand there is a huge difference between different tax rates and how items are taxed, and you can't take a rule from one and sometimes apply it well to the other. Getting back to the taxes, we're going to look at now tax on mutual funds. People are familiar with mutual funds. I'm not going to explain it, but I will explain a little bit about how each of these particular items are taxed. Mutual funds, most people buy them for the long term. Not a problem, but remember, you could be taxed even if you don't touch the money. Now, when I talk about mutual funds, I'm talking about mutual funds that are not inside of an IRA or 401k or any kind of a pension plan. They're treated very differently than mutual funds that are held outside of a plan. Let's look at some mutual fund tax issues. Mutual funds must distribute 90% of gains and dividends each year. That's taxed as regular income. If you have had mutual funds for a while, you'll know you get these 1099 DIVs, RINTs in there, very similar to what you're getting from a bank. The average fund turnover ratio is 100% or more, so that's generating a different kind of interest, gains, and taxes that you need to pay on these particular funds. That's taxed as regular income. Now, it's important to understand you can pay taxes even if the fund loses money. If people are getting out of a fund and they need to liquidate to pay these people their money to get them, to buy them out, as they liquidate, they may generate some capital gains in there. And if you're stuck holding the bag, you're going to get a tax due for capital gains. What happens, and I think it's pretty interesting, mutual fund tax issues, you have an ability to really determine how much and where or what you pay in taxes. When I tell people that you determine the tax treatment at issue, they look at me like, what are you talking about? No one ever told me I can determine what the taxes are going to be. Now, the IRS allows for three methods. The three methods are FIFO, specific identification, and average. That gives you three choices. Now, the huge difference between those choices is it could be a lot more taxes or a lot less taxes that are due. If you know the price you paid for the shares that you sold, then you can use something called specific share identification cost basis. It's a big word, but it simply is this. If you know what you pay for the shares, you can say, I want to sell those shares, and you can pick which ones you sell, and that will generate either no tax or very, very little tax. Now, if you don't know what the share price was, your broker or advisor, whoever was never told you to keep track of these things, you can use what they call a FIFO. It's first in, first out. And that simply is the first share that you purchase. You can use that price and pay the taxes due on that from that point forward. If you can't determine the price, and this is what I call the default, most people fall into this and wind up paying a lot more tax, is they use something called average basis. And what that simply means is they take all your shares, whatever you have, could be hundreds or hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of shares, they all pile them into one, they take a total of the number, they divide by the number of shares, and that's going to be your average price. The problem, the average method causes a higher tax payment. Very simply, I use an example sometime. Let's say you have, $100,000 in an investment, and you want $10,000 for whatever reason. Give it to a family member, a grandchild, spend, who cares? If you know what shares you can sell, you can take out $10,000 and pay zero tax. If you don't, and you use the average method, you could possibly pay $2,000 or maybe a little bit more tax on that money. So it's really critical that we start to understand taxes and how that really could affect us, especially if that extra money that's coming out tax, in this case I'm going to use the term tax-free, but because there's no tax due on it, that's a great way you can help pay for extra costs, again, the Medicare or Health Fund in retirement. That's the end of video 2. Let's do a quick review. We talked about Bob and Mary, compound interest and compound tax. We talked about the lost interest, the fact that once you give away that tax dollars to the IRS, you can never use it again, which is the mystery tax. We also reviewed a pay now or pay later. We talked about the capital gains tax, and there's no benefit for inflation. In other words, that tax dollars is not being considered, that the gain may not be as great because of inflation. Again, the mystery tax on this is no real gain. You're just trying to keep even. The capital gains tax scenario, danger, Will Robinson danger, that you got to be careful. You can't apply the two different methods with capital gains and ordinary income. We talk lightly about tax on a mutual fund, that you really choose the tax you pay and the three methods, the FIFO, specific ID, and average. And you always need to use a pro forma tax return. I stress that a lot. That's really going to be where the rubber meets the road. You can see this strategy. Is it working for me or is it not working for me?
Hi, I want to congratulate you on finishing section 2 of your video series. Again, I want to stress, if you have questions, make sure you take advantage of the Q&A, review your handouts, and you always have the chance to go back and review the video as we go forward. Very excited, looking forward to seeing you at the end of part 3. Thank you very much.